There's a particular kind of fog that settles around certain people, not the weather pattern that obscures visibility on morning highways, but the psychological kind that wraps itself around specific souls who understand something most others don't. It's the fog of people who've walked through Silent Hill's streets, not as tourists passing through a video game, but as pilgrims seeking something they couldn't name until they found it there in the rust and static. This is the reality for millions of people who don't just play Silent Hill. They need it. They return to it. They defend it. They see themselves reflected in its broken mirrors and blood-stained walls. You might assume these are simply horror game enthusiasts, people who enjoy a good scare and appreciate atmospheric design. But that assumption misses something profound about what Silent Hill does to certain minds, and more importantly, what certain minds bring to Silent Hill. The psychology behind loving Silent Hill is far more complex than preference or fandom. It's a web of personal trauma, emotional recognition, and a desperate hunger for art that acknowledges the darkness without flinching. Understanding this psychology reveals something uncomfortable about human suffering itself, how we seek it out in fiction when we can't process it in reality, how we find comfort in representations of our worst fears, and how a video game series about psychological torment became a lifeline for people drowning in their own. When researchers study the appeal of horror media, they discover something fascinating. The brain of someone who deeply connects with psychological horror doesn't just enjoy being scared. It's actually seeking validation for experiences most people refuse to acknowledge exist. Neural pathways associated with trauma recognition light up. The areas responsible for processing complex emotions become more active. It's as if the mind, starved of cultural representations of its actual lived experience, finally finds something that speaks its language. This isn't entertainment in the traditional sense, it's recognition, it's being seen. But how does someone become a Silent Hill devotee in the first place? The path to this particular form of love rarely happens with casual exposure. It's usually a collision between a vulnerable moment and the right piece of art. Maybe it started with playing Silent Hill 2 during a period of profound grief, recognizing James Sunderland's emotional paralysis in their own inability to process loss. Perhaps it was encountering Alessa Gillespie's story while dealing with their own childhood trauma, seeing in her burning a metaphor for their own abuse. Or it might have been Angela Roscoe's apartment hallway, that endless staircase conversation about hell being a personal experience, hitting someone at exactly the moment they needed to hear that their suffering was real and individual. Each of these experiences creates what psychologists call deep identification. The brain begins to associate Silent Hill not with entertainment but with emotional truth. With each game, with each replay, the connection strengthens. The foggy streets become familiar territory. The industrial decay of the other world starts feeling like an accurate representation of internal states. The radio static warns not just of approaching monsters, but of emotional danger. Silent Hill becomes a language for things that have no other words. This creates protective mechanisms around the franchise itself. When someone criticizes Silent Hill's controls, its pacing, its weird dialogue, fans don't just disagree. They defend these elements as essential. The clunky combat isn't a flaw, it's vulnerability made mechanical. The stilted voice acting isn't bad localization, it's dissociative numbness given sound. The slow, wandering pace isn't poor game design, it's the actual rhythm of processing trauma. These aren't conscious rationalizations, they're automatic responses designed to protect something that has become psychologically necessary. Over time, these protective mechanisms become invisible barriers between Silent Hill fans and other gaming communities. When someone says Resident Evil is better because it has tighter gameplay, Silent Hill fans hear an invalidation of their own experiences. When someone complains that nothing happens for long stretches, fans hear someone dismissing the importance of sitting with difficult emotions. They start interpreting neutral gaming criticism as personal attacks because Silent Hill has become intertwined with their sense of self. There's another layer to this psychology that's often overlooked. People who love Silent Hill frequently develop an intense relationship with analysis and interpretation. When external validation for their suffering has been limited, internal analysis becomes essential. They replay scenes endlessly, not for gameplay but for meaning. They scrutinize every environmental detail for symbolism. They watch hours of video essays dissecting psychological themes. They create elaborate theories about timeline placement and otherworld mechanics. This analytical obsession becomes both refuge and compulsion. It's a space where they can engage with trauma intellectually rather than emotionally, maintaining enough distance to function while still acknowledging what they're carrying. But it's also a space where thoughts can spiral without external grounding, without casual fans to challenge their interpretations or offer alternative viewpoints. Their understanding of Silent Hill can become increasingly rigid and personal. The games become mirrors showing only what they bring to them, which is precisely why they're so powerful, but also why discourse becomes so fraught. The irony is that many people who love Silent Hill possess exceptional pattern recognition and emotional literacy. They've spent so much time analyzing human behavior through the lens of these games that they often understand psychology better than people with formal training. They can spot defense mechanisms from across a conversation. They notice when someone's performance doesn't match their internal state. They pick up on thematic resonance in art that others consider pretentious or obscure. But this heightened awareness becomes a double edged sword. When you can see through surface level entertainment and recognize the psychological architecture underneath every narrative choice, it becomes harder to enjoy anything that doesn't meet those standards. The problem is that authentic artistic depth requires vulnerability from both creator and audience. And vulnerability feels terrifying when Silent Hill is often the only place where that vulnerability has felt safe. So fans wait. They wait for games that will respect their intelligence and their pain. They wait for horror that understands trauma as lived experience rather than plot device. They wait for developers who create spaces for genuine psychological exploration rather than cheap scares. But while they're waiting for this perfect communion of art and understanding, they often appear gatekeeping or elitist to outsiders. Casual fans trying to enter the community find themselves facing tests of knowledge, purity checks about which games count as real Silent Hill, and dismissal if they prefer action oriented horror. This creates a barrier that prevents even potentially deep connections from forming. The psychology of loving Silent Hill also affects how these individuals view themselves. Without the mirror of a welcoming community to reflect their positive qualities back to them, they often develop distorted self images based entirely on their relationship to the franchise. They identify as Silent Hill fans first, everything else second. They convince themselves they're too intense, too analytical, too damaged for mainstream gaming communities. This self perception becomes a lens through which they interpret every social interaction within gaming spaces. When someone expresses interest in their favorite Silent Hill game, they can't believe it's genuine. They assume the person is being polite, or they're testing them, or they'll eventually reveal they actually prefer the HD collection. This skepticism, while born from past dismissals, sabotages present opportunities for connection. What makes this particularly tragic is that people who love Silent Hill often crave community more intensely than casual fans. They've experienced the profound isolation that comes from not having their suffering acknowledged, so they understand the value of recognition in ways others take for granted. They don't want surface level gaming discussions or tier list arguments. They hunger for the kind of connection where silence about the game's meanings feels comfortable, where they can reference obscure symbolism and be understood, where they're truly known in their relationship to this art that saved them. This craving for depth over breadth means they often reject opportunities for lighter community interactions that could potentially develop into something more meaningful over time. They want to skip the casual fan conversations and dive straight into philosophical discussions about the nature of guilt or the metaphysics of the other world. But most community building needs time to develop that level of trust and vulnerability. The adaptation to this particular form of fandom also changes how they experience media and memory. Without shared experiences of playing Silent Hill blind for the first time, their relationship to their own first playthrough becomes sacred and unreplicable. They might struggle to recommend the games to others because nothing could recreate that initial revelation, or they might fixate on guide others through their first experience, living vicariously through each reaction, seeking to witness that moment of recognition they remember so powerfully. Their relationship with the franchise becomes complicated. On one hand, they've learned to find profound meaning in its symbolism because they've had to. They've developed rich interpretive frameworks, encyclopedic knowledge, and passionate defense mechanisms. But this comfort with the franchise can also become a trap. The longer they remain in Silent Hill communities, the more foreign other gaming spaces feel. The more foreign they feel, the more anxious they become about engaging with other genres. And the more anxious they become, the more they retreat into familiar fog. The cycle deepens when they realize how much social capital they've built exclusively around Silent Hill knowledge. Conversations that once felt natural now require conscious effort to avoid franchise references. They second guess sharing opinions about other games, overthink their engagement with other horror properties, and analyze every gaming discussion for signs that they're too narrow in their interests. What used to be passionate focus becomes something that feels like limitation. This psychology also changes their relationship with anticipation and disappointment. Every new Silent Hill announcement triggers a complex emotional response. Hope that maybe this time someone will understand what made the series special. Fear that it'll be another cynical cash grab that misses the point entirely. Anger at Konami's mismanagement. Grief for what Team Silent could have continued creating. This isn't the simple anticipation of a new entry in a favorite series. It's a referendum on whether their pain and the art that acknowledged it will be respected or exploited. When Silent Hill, Homecoming, or Downpour failed to capture what made the original game special, it wasn't just disappointment, it felt like invalidation. When PT got canceled, it wasn't just a game being scrapped. It felt like having hope violently torn away. When the HD collection ruined the atmosphere with new fog effects and voice acting, it wasn't just poor remastering. It felt like someone paving over sacred ground. These reactions seem disproportionate to outsiders, but they make perfect sense when you understand that Silent Hill isn't just entertainment for these people, it's a witness to their suffering. There's another fascinating dimension to this psychology regarding the relationship with Akira Yamaoka's music. For many Silent Hill devotees, the soundtracks exist as standalone emotional experiences completely separate from the games. They listen to Theme of Laura or Room of Angel or You're Not Here, not as video game music, but as genuine artistic expression that captures specific emotional states they can't articulate otherwise. The music becomes a shorthand for complex feelings. When they're processing grief, they reach for certain tracks. When they're battling with guilt, different songs speak to them. The industrial noise represents their rage. The melancholic piano pieces hold their sadness. The ambient tracks create space for their anxiety. Yamaoka's compositions become an emotional vocabulary that allows them to access feelings that would otherwise remain trapped. This creates an interesting paradox. Many people who love Silent Hill describe the soundtracks as relaxing or comforting, which seems contradictory for music designed to create dread, but it makes perfect sense from a psychological perspective. These tracks represent acknowledgement. They're proof that the emotions they carry exist and are valid enough to be represented in art. The dissonance and noise aren't disturbing, they're validating. Someone else heard the static. Someone else felt the rust and decay. Someone else knew that sometimes beautiful melodies need to exist alongside industrial grinding because that's what emotional truth sounds like. The psychology of isolation also manifests in how Silent Hill fans engage with horror as a genre. They become connoisseurs of specific types of fear, not jump scares or gore, but psychological dread and existential horror. They can articulate exactly why certain horror works and others fail. They understand that the scariest thing isn't the monster, but what the monster represents. That true horror comes from recognition rather than shock, that the most effective dread builds through absence rather than presence. This expertise creates both connection and distance within horror communities. They find kindred spirits among people who appreciate Jacob's Ladder, David Lynch films, and Junji Ito's manga, art that operates on similar psychological wavelengths as Silent Hill. But they also find themselves frustrated by horror fans who only want surface level scares, who complain when a film is too slow or a game doesn't have enough action. The patience required for psychological horror feels natural to them, but explaining why becomes exhausting. The mirror and the action hero, what Resident Evil fans reveal about Silent Hill devotees. Perhaps nowhere is the psychology of Silent Hill fans more clearly illuminated than when compared to people who prefer Resident Evil. These two franchises emerged in the same era, on the same console, both labeled survival horror, yet they attracted fundamentally different types of people. Understanding this divide reveals something crucial about what Silent Hill offers that nothing else does, and more importantly, what type of person needs that specific offering. Resident Evil fans, broadly speaking, engage with horror as a challenge to be overcome. They enjoy the tension of limited resources, the satisfaction of perfectly executed headshots, the triumph of surviving against overwhelming odds. The horror in Resident Evil is external and defeatable. Zombies can be killed, Umbrella Corporation can be exposed, Wesker can be stopped. There's always a final boss, always a helicopter escape, always closure. The player becomes competent through mastery. Learn the enemy patterns, manage your inventory efficiently, conserve ammo strategically, and you win. This appeals to a psychology that finds comfort in agency and control. Resident Evil tells you that problems, even horrific ones, can be solved through skill and determination. The world is dangerous but ultimately coherent. There are good guys and bad guys. Evil has identifiable sources: corporations, mad scientists, terrorists. Action produces results. The trained operative prevails. These are psychologically stabilizing messages, which is perhaps why Resident Evil has maintained mainstream popularity, even as it shifted toward action. Silent Hill fans, by contrast, don't engage with horror as something to be overcome. They engage with it as something to be endured, processed, and perhaps, if they're lucky, understood. The horror in Silent Hill is internal and permanent. You can't shoot your guilt. You can't inventory manage your trauma. There's no final boss that represents the totality of your suffering, waiting to be defeated so the credits can roll. James can confront Pyramid Head, but Pyramid Head is James. The confrontation doesn't end the guilt, it just forces recognition of what was already there. This appeals to a completely different psychology, one that doesn't find comfort in agency because agency failed them when it mattered most, one that knows from experience that some problems don't have solutions, only accommodation, that the world often isn't coherent, that suffering frequently has no identifiable source, that action doesn't always produce results, and that sometimes you survive something without ever really escaping it. These are psychologically destabilizing truths, which is why Silent Hill has always been niche compared to Resident Evil's mass appeal. The distinction becomes even clearer when examining what each fan base criticizes about the other franchise. Resident Evil fans often describe Silent Hill as too slow, too pretentious, style over substance. They complain about the clunky combat, the obscure puzzles, the deliberate withholding of information. These complaints reveal that they're approaching Silent Hill with Resident Evil's metrics, expecting agency, mastery, progression, and closure. When Silent Hill doesn't provide these things, they experience it as failure rather than intention. Silent Hill fans, meanwhile, describe Resident Evil as shallow, action schlock, B movie nonsense. They dismiss the straightforward plots, the heroic protagonists, the explosive endings. These criticisms reveal that they're approaching Resident Evil with Silent Hill's metrics, expecting psychological complexity, symbolic depth, emotional ambiguity, and ongoing uncertainty. When Resident Evil doesn't provide these things, they experience it as insufficiency rather than different purpose. Neither group is wrong exactly. They're just revealing what they need from horror media, which in turn reveals something about their psychological relationship with fear itself. Resident Evil fans need horror they can defeat because that provides catharsis and reinforces their sense of agency. They enjoy being scared, but they need that fear to be temporary and resolvable. The game says, yes, the world contains terrible things, but you are capable of handling them. This is a psychologically reassuring message that allows them to engage with horror as entertainment. Silent Hill fans need horror they can't defeat because that provides validation. They need fear that lingers because that matches their lived experience. They don't want catharsis, they want recognition. The game says, yes, the world contains terrible things, and sometimes you can't handle them, and that's not your fault, and you're not alone in carrying that weight. This is a psychologically validating message that allows them to engage with horror as witness. The protagonist difference is particularly telling. Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Leon Kennedy, these are capable people thrust into terrible situations. They're trained operatives, they have skills, they rise to challenges. Players embody competence. When bad things happen to these characters, it's because of external evil, bioterrorists, corrupt corporations, mad scientists. The characters themselves remain fundamentally heroic. Their trauma is situational. Remove them from the situation and they're fine. James Sunderland, Angela Orozco, Harry Mason. These are broken people drawn to a town that manifests their internal damage. They're not trained for this. They fumble with weapons, they make bad decisions. Players embody vulnerability. When bad things happen to these characters, it's often because they caused those bad things or failed to prevent them. The characters themselves are complicit in their own suffering. Their trauma is constitutional. The situation is the externalization of what was already broken inside them. Resident Evil fans can admire the characters they play as. Silent Hill fans recognize themselves in the characters they play as. This distinction matters enormously. One franchise offers aspirational gameplay, become the action hero. The other offers confessional gameplay, admit what you really are. These appeal to fundamentally different psychological needs. The ending structures reveal the same divide. Resident Evil typically offers one or two endings based on minor variations. Did you save this person? Did you collect all the treasures? Did you complete the game fast enough? The endings are rewards for gameplay performance. Silent Hill offers multiple endings based on how you played emotionally. Did you prioritize finding your wife or protecting another person? Did you maintain your health or neglect it? Did you examine certain items that suggest suicidal ideation? The endings are reflections of psychological state. Resident Evil fans enjoy optimization. They speed run for better endings. They min max resources. They perfect their routes. The games reward mastery, and mastery feels good. It provides a sense of control and achievement. Silent Hill fans often don't even know which ending they're heading toward until it happens. They're not optimizing, they're expressing. They play the game however their current emotional state dictates, and the ending they receive reflects who they were during that playthrough. The games reward honesty, and honesty feels necessary even when it doesn't feel good. This extends to how each fan base engages with difficulty. Resident Evil fans often play on harder difficulties for the challenge and the bragging rights. Successfully completing Resident Evil on hardcore mode is an achievement that demonstrates skill. It's something to be proud of. Silent Hill fans often don't engage with difficulty settings in the same way. The challenge isn't the point. Playing Silent Hill 2 on easy versus hard doesn't significantly change the psychological experience. The difficulty is in confronting what the game shows you about yourself, and that difficulty can't be adjusted in the settings menu. The community dynamics differ correspondingly. Resident Evil communities bond over shared accomplishments. Difficult sections conquered, speedrun times compared, inventory strategies debated. There's a celebratory energy. We survived this together. We beat the challenge. We mastered the system. Silent Hill communities bond over shared damage. Similar traumas recognized. Symbolic interpretations compared. Emotional impacts shared. There's a memorial energy. We suffered this together. We witnessed each other. We validated what matters. Neither community dynamic is inherently superior, but they serve completely different psychological functions. Resident Evil communities build collective efficacy, the sense that together we are capable. Silent Hill communities build collective recognition, the sense that together we are seen. People are drawn to whichever type of community addresses their core psychological need. The relationship with horror. Violence illustrates another fascinating division. Resident Evil features explicit violence, heads exploding, limbs severing, blood spattering. This gore serves multiple purposes: visceral impact, body horror, and cathartic destruction of threats. The violence is against the player but also available to the player. You can blow apart the thing that's chasing you. There's satisfaction in that, a sense of fighting back against horror. Silent Hill features symbolic violence, Angela's monster being a phallic, nightmare bed creature, James's monsters having feminine features and constrained movement, Walter Sullivan's victims positioned in ritual arrangements. This violence isn't about physical destruction but psychological recognition. You can beat these monsters, but you can't destroy what they represent. There's no satisfaction in it, only exhaustion and temporary reprieve. The horror isn't external enough to be blown apart. Resident Evil fans appreciate the agency of violence. They enjoy the arsenal of weapons, the different ammunition types, the ability to fight back effectively. The game respects their desire to defend themselves. Silent Hill fans often actively avoid combat when possible because fighting their own externalized trauma feels pointless and exhausting. The game respects their desire to simply survive and move forward. The tone difference matters significantly. Resident Evil maintains a certain campy B movie quality, even in its most serious entries. Over the top villains monologue about world domination. Action sequences feature impossible stunts. One liners punctuate tense moments. There's a deliberate distance between the player and genuine emotional investment. You're watching a horror movie that you control. The campiness provides psychological insulation. It's scary, but it's also kind of ridiculous, which makes it safe to enjoy. Silent Hill maintains a depressive realism even in its most fantastical moments. Conversations feel awkward and strained. Characters seem genuinely damaged. Symbolism is never explained or made safe through ironic distance. You're not watching, you're implicated. The game refuses to provide psychological insulation. It's disturbing, and it wants to disturb you because disturbance is how recognition happens. People who need horror to be fun, at least in the sense of exciting and engaging, gravitate toward Resident Evil. People who need horror to be meaningful, in the sense of psychologically significant and personally relevant, gravitate toward Silent Hill. These aren't moral categories. Needing fun isn't shallow, and needing meaning isn't superior. They're just different psychological relationships with fear and suffering. The franchise trajectories reveal how each has had to navigate changing audience expectations. When Resident Evil shifted toward action in RE4 and RE5, many old school fans complained, but the games achieved massive commercial success. The franchise discovered that most people prefer horror that's exciting over horror that's oppressive. When Silent Hill attempted to add more action in Homecoming and Downpour, both critically and commercially underperformed. The franchise discovered that its specific audience doesn't want empowerment, they want recognition. This created an interesting divergence. Resident Evil survived by becoming more of what casual audiences wanted, occasionally returning to pure horror for one-off entries like RE7 before swinging back toward action. It maintained relevance by refusing to be pigeonholed. Silent Hill couldn't survive the same way because its audience is more purist and much smaller. You can't grow a niche audience by making it less niche. You just alienate the people who needed that specific thing. The relationship with replay value operates differently. Resident Evil games are endlessly replayable for mechanical reasons. Speedrun challenges, unlockable weapons, different character routes, achievement hunting. Each replay is about improving performance or seeing content you missed. You're playing the game more skillfully. Silent Hill games are selectively replayable for emotional reasons, returning when you're in a specific headspace, or years later when your relationship to the themes has changed, or to see different endings that reflect different psychological states. Each replay is about engaging with your own evolution. You're not playing the game more skillfully, you're bringing a different self to it. Resident Evil fans will often describe their favorite entry as the most fun or the most balanced mechanically. Silent Hill fans describe their favorite entry as the most personally significant or the most emotionally devastating. These metrics don't translate across fan bases. A Resident Evil fan hearing, "Silent Hill 2 destroyed me emotionally," might think, "Why would you want that?" A Silent Hill fan hearing RE4 has perfect game feel might think, "But what does it mean?" The comparison ultimately reveals that loving Silent Hill requires a specific kind of emotional availability or unavailability, depending on perspective. It requires being in a psychological place where recognition matters more than resolution, where being seen matters more than being capable, where enduring matters more than overcoming. This isn't superior to loving Resident Evil, it's different. But it does explain why Silent Hill fans can seem so intense, so protective, so unwilling to engage with criticism that treats the games as simply another example of survival horror. They're not defending a game franchise, they're defending the thing that saw them when nothing else did. And when someone says Resident Evil is better because it has better gameplay, what Silent Hill fans hear is your need for recognition is less valid than someone else's need for fun. When someone says Silent Hill is too slow and boring, what fans hear is your suffering is too slow and boring to deserve artistic representation. This is why the debates between fan bases so often feel hostile and unresolvable. They're not actually debating game quality, they're defending completely different psychological needs, and neither side can fully understand the other without acknowledging that horror serves different purposes for different people. For some, it's entertainment that processes fear through mastery. For others, it's validation that processes trauma through recognition. Both are legitimate, both matter, but they'll never agree on which franchise is better because they're not playing the same kind of game. Understanding this divide helps explain why Silent Hill fans are the way they are. They're not pretentious for preferring psychological depth, they need it. They're not gatekeeping when they reject action horror hybrids. They're protecting something that can't be protected any other way. They're not overthinking symbolism. They're using the only language available for experiences that otherwise remain unspeakable. And they're not wrong for being intense about games that most people consider niche curiosities. They're responding appropriately to art that performs psychological work nothing else could. The person who prefers Resident Evil isn't psychologically healthier. They just have different damage, or no damage in those particular places, or damage they process differently. The person who needs Silent Hill isn't psychologically weaker. They just have specific wounds that require specific medicine. Both franchises offer horror, but one offers horror as opponent, and one offers horror as mirror. And the type of person you are determines which of those you need. People who love Silent Hill develop an intense dialogue with Silent Hill. They have conversations with Pyramid Head about guilt. They argue with James about whether his actions were forgivable. They question Claudia about whether paradise built on suffering could ever be worth it. They thank Team Silent for creating something that saw them when nothing else did. These internal conversations aren't delusion or parasocial relationship. They're a form of active engagement with art that has become psychologically integrated. The games ask questions without providing answers, which creates space for ongoing internal dialogue. Is James a sympathetic character or a monster? Does the distinction matter? What does it mean that we can embody someone who commits an unforgivable act and still want them to find peace? What does that say about us as players? These questions don't have correct answers, which means the conversation never ends. It becomes a framework for processing their own moral complexity, their own unforgivable acts, their own journey towards something that might resemble peace. This internal world becomes both sanctuary and echo chamber. It's a place where they can explore the darkest parts of themselves without judgment, where their trauma can be examined through the safety of fiction, where guilt and shame can be acknowledged without drowning in them. But it's also a place where perspectives can become increasingly isolated. Without external input, their interpretations can drift into territories that feel personally significant but lose connection to the text itself. The concept of Silent Hill as a physical place takes on psychological significance. For many fans, Silent Hill exists as a mental location they can visit when reality becomes overwhelming. Not the literal game worlds, but a psychological space characterized by fog, introspection, and confrontation with difficult truths. When they're struggling, they go to Silent Hill mentally, retreating into that headspace where emotional complexity is expected rather than pathologized. This creates an unusual relationship with escapism. Most people use media to escape their problems. Silent Hill fans use Silent Hill to escape into their problems, to spend time with them in a controlled environment where suffering has meaning and monsters have symbolic logic. The games offer not distraction but concentration, a focused space for engaging with pain that would be too overwhelming to face directly in reality. Their relationship with the different Silent Hill games often correlates with their own psychological journey. Someone might connect most deeply with Silent Hill 2 during a period of guilt and grief. Later, Silent Hill 3's themes of inherited trauma and identity might resonate more powerfully. Silent Hill 4's claustrophobia and isolation could speak to pandemic era experiences. Origins might connect with someone examining their childhood. Each game becomes relevant at different life stages, creating a relationship with the franchise that evolves alongside personal growth. This also means that criticism of specific games can feel like criticism of specific life periods. Someone defending Silent Hill, Homecoming isn't just defending a game, they're defending the version of themselves that needed that particular story at that particular time. When someone dismisses shattered memories as not being real Silent Hill, they might be unknowingly invalidating another person's genuine psychological experience with that game. The psychology of Silent Hill love also involves complicated relationships with the concept of getting better. Many fans describe the games as therapeutic, as helping them process trauma or understand their own psychology, but there's often an underlying fear that healing might mean losing their connection to something that defined them. If they process their guilt, will James's story still resonate? If they work through their trauma, will they still understand why Angela's other world appears as it does? This creates resistance to both personal growth and to any suggestion that their relationship with Silent Hill might be unhealthy. They're not obsessed, they're passionate. They're not avoiding real world engagement, they're engaging with art that matters. They're not using the games as a crutch, they're appreciating psychological depth that most people miss. These defensive postures aren't entirely wrong, but they can prevent honest self examination about when appreciation crosses into something else. Understanding the psychology of people who love Silent Hill reveals something profound about the relationship between art and suffering. That certain works don't just reflect human experience, they become integrated into it. They provide language for the unspeakable, validation for the invisible, and company for the isolated. Silent Hill didn't create the pain its fans carry, but it acknowledged that pain exists and treated it with the seriousness it deserves. But perhaps most importantly, understanding this psychology shows that deep connection to art isn't pathological. The person who has replayed Silent Hill 2 30 times isn't damaged or obsessed in any simple sense. They found something rare, art that meets them at their level of complexity and doesn't ask them to be simpler than they are. They've discovered a framework for understanding their own psychology that actually works for them, even if it seems strange to others. For those walking this particular foggy path, remember that your depth, your analytical intensity, your refusal to accept surface level explanations aren't obstacles to connection. They're proof that you take your own experience seriously. that you demand art respect your intelligence and your pain, that you won't accept easy answers to hard questions. These qualities didn't come from Silent Hill, they led you to it. The game simply reflected what was already there, waiting to be seen. The defensive posture that Silent Hill fans sometimes adopt reveals another layer of psychology worth examining. When someone has built significant parts of their identity and emotional processing around a franchise, any threat to that franchise becomes a threat to self. This isn't unique to Silent Hill. Every fandom experiences this to some degree, but Silent Hill fandom carries additional weight because the games deal with such personally significant themes. When Bloober Team announced they were remaking Silent Hill 2, the community response split into camps with an intensity that seemed disproportionate. But from a psychological perspective, it made perfect sense. The game had existed as a sacred text for many people, something they returned to in specific emotional states, something that held personal significance beyond entertainment value. The prospect of it being altered, reinterpreted, or potentially misunderstood by new developers triggered genuine fear. This wasn't gatekeeping for gatekeeping's sake. It was protection of something that had protected them. The thought of their Silent Hill being replaced by someone else's Silent Hill felt like erasure. What if the new version became the definitive one? What if the aspects that resonated most deeply with them got fixed or modernized away? What if the thing that had witnessed their suffering got recontextualized as merely a product? These fears explain the intensity of discussions about what makes something Silent Hill. The debates about whether Homecoming or Downpour count as real entries aren't just fandom arguments, they're defining boundaries around what qualifies as legitimate psychological experience. When someone says a game isn't really Silent Hill, they're often saying, "This game doesn't do the psychological work that I need Silent Hill to do." It's a qualitative judgment disguised as a categorical one. The relationship with Team Silent as creators takes on almost mythological proportions. They become the artists who understood, who got it right, who created something pure before corporate interference ruined it. This isn't entirely wrong. Team Silent did create something remarkable before the franchise was spread across multiple developers with varying success. But the intensity of devotion to that specific creative team reveals how much fans need to believe that somewhere, someone understood perfectly. This creates an interesting dynamic with any new Silent Hill content. It must prove itself worthy not just of the franchise name, but of the psychological work fans need it to do. It must demonstrate that it understands what Silent Hill really means, not the surface elements of fog and monsters and rusty textures, but the underlying architecture of guilt and trauma and confrontation with self. This is an almost impossible standard, which is why so much post Team Silent content has been rejected by core fans. The psychology also extends to how Silent Hill devotees consume other media. They develop extremely refined taste in psychological horror, able to immediately identify when something is authentic versus when it's performative. They can smell try-hard edginess from a mile away. They recognize when darkness is there for shock value versus when it emerges from genuine emotional exploration. This creates a small pool of art they consider worthwhile, which reinforces their isolation while also protecting them from shallow imitations of depth. Films like Jacob's Ladder, Requiem for a Dream, or Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind join their canon. Books by authors who understand trauma like Shirley Jackson or Octavia Butler. Games like Soma, Spec Ops, The Line, or Pathologic that engage with psychological complexity, but the list remains deliberately limited. Better to have 5 pieces of art that truly understand than 100 that pretend to. Their pattern recognition extends to identifying other people who would get Silent Hill. They can often spot potential fans, people carrying similar weight, people who seem to exist slightly out of phase with normal social interaction, people who ask questions that suggest they're processing something underneath. Sometimes they try to guide these people toward the games, hoping to share something that helped them. Sometimes they remain silent, unwilling to risk their sacred thing being misunderstood or dismissed. The concept of spoilers operates differently in Silent Hill fandom than in most gaming communities. The plot twists, James killing Mary, Heather being Alessa, Travis being manipulated, these aren't what the games are about. You can know every narrative beat and still be completely unprepared for the emotional experience. This creates a paradox where fans simultaneously want to preserve the experience of discovery while also feeling that the games can't be spoiled in any meaningful sense. What they want to protect isn't plot information, but the psychological journey, the slow dawning realization of what James has done, the growing understanding of what Angela has suffered, the gradual recognition of your own patterns in these characters. These can't be spoiled because they happen internally, at the pace your psyche can handle them. Someone can tell you James killed Mary, but that doesn't prepare you for what it feels like to realize you've been controlling a murderer you've sympathized with. This understanding of how psychological horror works creates tension with spoiler phobic gaming culture. Silent Hill fans sometimes seem cavalier about revealing plot points, which gets read as disrespect for new players, but from their perspective, they're not spoiling anything important. They're providing context that might help someone approach the games with appropriate emotional preparation. The real experience can't be conveyed through plot summary any more than you can explain trauma by listing events. The relationship with game preservation takes on ethical dimensions. Many Silent Hill fans consider the PC version of Silent Hill 2 to be definitive, but getting it running properly requires technical knowledge and legally gray workarounds. The HD collection is widely available, but considered inferior due to changed fog effects, new voice acting, and various bugs. This creates a dilemma: support preservation and original artistic vision through piracy, or support legitimate access through compromised ports. For fans who view these games as psychologically necessary rather than mere entertainment, preservation becomes a moral imperative. These aren't just games that might disappear, they're witnesses to suffering, frameworks for understanding trauma, artistic validation of experiences most people deny exist. The thought of them becoming lost or only available in corrupted forms feels like cultural erasure of something that doesn't have many other representations. Their relationship with horror gaming as an industry reveals frustration with trends that move away from psychological depth. The rise of games focused on hiding from indestructible enemies feels reductive. The emphasis on photorealism over artistic direction seems to miss the point. The prevalence of found footage mechanics or multiplayer horror suggests developers misunderstand what makes horror effective at a psychological level. This frustration isn't elitism, though it often gets labeled that way. It's grief for a type of game design that briefly existed, proved profoundly effective for certain people, then mostly disappeared as the industry chased different markets. Amnesia, The Dark Descent, Soma, Layers of Fear. These games exist and carry on some of Silent Hill's legacy, but they're exceptions in an industry that increasingly treats horror as a modifier on action games rather than as its own psychological territory. The community dynamics around Silent Hill reveal both the best and worst of how trauma survivors relate to each other. At its best, the community offers profound understanding, shared vocabulary, and mutual recognition that validates experiences the wider world dismisses. At its worst, it becomes competitive suffering, purity tests about who really understands, and gatekeeping that keeps out anyone who doesn't demonstrate proper appreciation. Someone new to the franchise might post about how scary Pyramid Head is, only to be met with lectures about how he represents guilt and punishment, not generic monster horror. This response comes from a place of wanting to share deeper understanding, but lands as condescension. The desire to protect the games from shallow interpretation creates barriers to entry that prevent the community from growing. This creates a self perpetuating cycle. The community remains small and intense, which reinforces outsiders' perception of Silent Hill fans as obsessive and gatekeeping, which makes new fans hesitant to engage, which keeps the community small and intense. Breaking this cycle requires recognizing that someone's first impression of Pyramid Head as scary isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. They're at the beginning of a journey that might lead them to deeper understanding, or might not, and both paths are valid. The psychology of Silent Hill love also encompasses relationship with difficulty and frustration. The games are often clunky, obtuse, poorly signposted. Puzzles require obscure logic. Combat feels deliberately unwieldy. Navigation through identical looking streets can be maddening. For most players, these are flaws. For devoted fans, they're features, obstacles that force you to sit with discomfort, to persist without clear reward, to trust that meaning exists even when you can't immediately see it. This mirrors the experience of processing trauma. You can't skip to the end. You can't optimize the path. You have to walk through the fog even when you can't see where you're going, trusting that eventually some landmark will become visible. The game's mechanical frustrations train patience with ambiguity, tolerance for discomfort, and persistence without clear progress markers, all skills necessary for psychological healing. Their relationship with Silent Hill's multiple endings reveals interesting priorities. The leave ending in Silent Hill 2, where James accepts what he's done and walks away to build a new life, is often considered the good ending. But many fans gravitate toward In Water, where James drives into Toluca Lake to join Mary in death, not because they want James dead, but because that ending feels emotionally true to the weight he's carrying. This preference for emotional authenticity over moral optimism extends to their own self perception. They'd rather acknowledge how damaged they are than pretend they're fine. They'd rather sit with guilt and grief than perform recovery they haven't achieved. Silent Hill gave them permission to be honest about how not okay they are, and they protect that permission fiercely because so little else in their lives offers it. The game's treatment of suicide, abuse, and mental illness resonates because it never feels exploitative. Angela's story doesn't use her trauma as a plot device. It portrays trauma as the reality that shapes every aspect of how she experiences the world. Eddie's story doesn't excuse his violence but shows how cumulative humiliation can break someone. James's story doesn't ask you to forgive him, but forces you to understand the human capability for unforgivable acts. This respectful engagement with dark subject matter becomes a baseline for fans. They develop zero tolerance for media that treats trauma casually, that uses mental illness as shorthand for danger, that deploys sexual violence for shock value. Silent Hill showed them that it's possible to engage with these topics seriously, and they refuse to accept less from other art. Their defense of Silent Hill's bad voice acting in the early games reveals similar priorities. The stilted, emotionally flat delivery isn't actually bad acting, it's dissociation made audible. That weird pause before Mary says, "James, you made me happy," in the original Silent Hill 2. That's the sound of someone struggling to access real emotion through terminal illness and marital resentment. The delivery doesn't sound natural because the emotional states being portrayed aren't natural. When the HD collection replaced the original voice acting with more conventionally good performances, it fundamentally changed the game's psychology. The characters sounded like actors pretending to be damaged people rather than damaged people struggling to communicate. This distinction matters enormously to fans because they recognize that dissociative flatness in their own speech patterns, their own difficulty accessing and expressing emotion. The relationship between Silent Hill fans and the concept of fun in gaming is complicated. They don't play Silent Hill for fun in any traditional sense. They play it for recognition, for catharsis, for confrontation with parts of themselves they can't face directly. When someone asks, "Is Silent Hill fun?" they often struggle to answer because the question reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what the games are for. It's like asking if therapy is fun. Sometimes, maybe, in moments of breakthrough, but that's not why you go. You go because you need to process something you can't process alone. You go because the alternative is letting it fester. You go because some part of you knows that confronting the thing might be the only way through it. Silent Hill functions as therapeutic art for people who need it, even when, especially when, engaging with it feels difficult. This creates tension with gaming culture's emphasis on enjoyment as the primary metric for quality. Silent Hill fans often describe their experience with phrases like, "one of the best games I'll never play again," or "important but difficult," or "meaningful rather than enjoyable." These descriptors confuse people whose relationship with games centers on entertainment value, but they perfectly capture the psychology of engaging with art that reflects your damage back at you. The game's environments, the rust, the blood, the decay, become aesthetic preferences that extend beyond gaming. Many Silent Hill devotees find beauty in industrial decay, in abandoned spaces, in things that are broken and stained and falling apart, not because they romanticize destruction, but because those environments feel honest in a way polished spaces don't. The veneer is gone, the truth is visible. There's something comforting about being in spaces that don't pretend to be anything other than what they are. This aesthetic preference sometimes manifests in their own self presentation. They might dress in worn clothes, avoid makeup or polished appearances, prefer spaces that feel lived in rather than decorated. It's not depression or giving up. It's an active choice to exist in a way that matches how they feel internally. The dissonance between performing normalcy and feeling broken becomes exhausting. Oh, why not just be broken on the outside too? At least it's honest. Their relationship with hope is complicated by Silent Hill's general pessimism. The games rarely offer unambiguously good endings. Even the best outcomes are bittersweet, tinged with loss and uncertainty. This matches how many fans experience their own recovery, not as triumph or achievement, but as learning to carry weight without collapsing under it. Progress doesn't mean the trauma disappears, it means building enough strength that the burden becomes bearable. This understanding creates skepticism toward narratives of redemption or healing that feel too clean. When media shows trauma being overcome through a few good therapy sessions or the power of friendship, Silent Hill fans roll their eyes. Their own experience tells them healing looks more like James walking into the fog with Laura, uncertain but persisting, or Heather renaming herself Cheryl as an act of claiming inherited suffering rather than escaping it. The game's use of symbolic monsters created a framework that fans apply to their own psychology. They might think of their depression as a lying figure, something that restrains them, suffocates them, keeps them from moving freely. Their anxiety becomes abstract daddy, a presence born from trauma that distorts how they perceive the world. Their guilt takes Pyramid Head's form, a punishing presence they both fear and feel they deserve. This internalized monster manual provides language for internal states that otherwise remain abstract and overwhelming. Instead of saying, I'm depressed, they can recognize which specific type of depression monster they're dealing with today. This might seem like overthinking or dramatization, but it's actually a sophisticated coping mechanism that makes internal states tangible and therefore manageable. Their engagement with Silent Hill lore and timeline debates serves similar psychological functions, arguing about whether the other world existed before Alessa or was created by her suffering, debating the relationship between SH1's cult and SH3's order, theorizing about the town's origins. These discussions create a sense of control. The games themselves are ambiguous and open to interpretation. Fan communities build structures of understanding that make the uncertainty feel less threatening. This need for structure and explanation sometimes conflicts with the game's deliberate ambiguity. When Team Silent members give interviews that contradict fan theories, there's often resistance. The creator's intended meanings matter less than the meanings fans have constructed, because those constructed meanings have done real psychological work. They've helped process trauma, provided frameworks for understanding, created communities of shared interpretation. The relationship with Silent Hill merchandise reveals interesting priorities. Official merchandise often feels wrong to fans, too clean, too marketed, too divorced from what the games actually mean. Pyramid Head on a t-shirt becomes a generic horror icon rather than a specific representation of guilt and punishment. A plush Robbie, the rabbit, loses the uncanniness that made the character disturbing. Merchandising strips the psychology away, leaving only aesthetic. Fans often prefer no merchandise to bad merchandise. Better to have nothing than to have something that misrepresents what Silent Hill means to them. When good merchandise does appear, high quality figures that capture the atmosphere, art books that respect the symbolism, soundtracks that present the music properly, they invest heavily, not as collection for collection's sake, but as preservation of something important. Their relationship with newcomers to the franchise reflects both generosity and protection. Many desperately want others to experience what Silent Hill offers. They create detailed guides for getting the PC versions running, recommend play orders, warn about which entries to avoid, but they also watch nervously, worried that the person won't understand, will play too casually, will dismiss something that matters deeply. This creates an odd dynamic where fans simultaneously encourage and gatekeep. Come play Silent Hill, but play it right. Experience it, but experience it seriously. Engage with it, but engage with it on its own terms. These contradictory impulses come from a place of love and protection, but they can make entry into the community feel like navigating a minefield. The game's exploration of guilt resonates powerfully, because guilt is often the emotion trauma survivors feel most intensely. Guilt over what happened to them, guilt over how they responded, guilt over not being able to just get over it and move on. Silent Hill, particularly Silent Hill 2, takes guilt seriously as an emotion worth exploring rather than resolving. James doesn't get absolved. He gets to choose what he does with the weight he carries. This permission to not be forgiven, to not recover, to not be okay, provides immense relief to people trapped in cycles of self-punishment. The game suggests that maybe the point isn't to achieve redemption, but to acknowledge what you've done and what's been done to you, then persist anyway. That's not a conventionally hopeful message, but for certain people at certain times, it's exactly what they need to hear. The psychology of loving Silent Hill ultimately reveals itself as a psychology of needing to be seen. The games see their players, not who they pretend to be, not who they think they should be, but who they actually are in all their damage and complexity. For people who have spent their lives being invisible, being misunderstood, or being simplified into stereotypes, that act of being truly seen is transformative. Silent Hill doesn't offer solutions, it offers recognition. And sometimes when you're suffocating under the weight of experiences nobody acknowledges exist, recognition is what keeps you breathing. The fog doesn't lift, but you're no longer walking through it alone. The monsters don't disappear, but someone else has seen them too and created a map of their territory. The suffering doesn't end, but it achieves meaning through artistic representation. People who love Silent Hill aren't broken in some simple sense. They're people who take their own experiences seriously enough to demand art that does the same. They're people who refuse to accept easy answers to hard questions about guilt, trauma, identity, and suffering. They're people who have looked into psychological abysses that most people spend their lives avoiding, and they've emerged wanting art that acknowledges those abysses exist. The games didn't create what these fans carry. They simply looked at it without flinching and said, yes, this is real, this matters, you're not alone in this. And here's a language for talking about things that usually have no words. For some people, that recognition is everything. It's the difference between drowning silently and gasping out a name for what's pulling them under. It's not salvation, but it's witness, and sometimes witness is enough. Understanding the psychology of people who love Silent Hill means understanding that certain art doesn't just reflect experience, it validates experience. It provides frameworks for processing trauma that nothing else offers. It creates communities of recognition among people who have spent their lives being invisible, and it demonstrates that depth, complexity, and refusal to accept simple narratives aren't obstacles to appreciation. They're exactly what makes someone capable of understanding what Silent Hill offers. For those who walk these foggy streets, your connection to these games isn't obsession or escapism in any pathological sense. It's recognition of art that respected your intelligence and your pain. It's gratitude for something that saw you when nothing else did. It's the perfectly rational response of taking seriously art that took you seriously. The fog may be heavy, the rust may be spreading, and the radio may always crackle with static, but you're not alone in understanding what it all means.